Welcome to week 4, everyone. I hope you're enjoying this class so far half as much as I am. Some really great discussions. I think some sensitive engagement with the texts of Matthew. Some really thoughtful responses to the secondary reading, whether that's stuff that I've written or other materials that we've been using to kind of help us wrestle with the gospel narrative. I think a lot of really insightful attention to how the narrative is helping us frame our interpretive questions and to focus our grappling with what Jesus is doing, what he's saying, what the story is telling us about this kingdom coming from heaven, or increasingly what it means to follow Jesus as disciples. So just really appreciative of the hard work, and I think it's benefiting all of us, so thank you. I want to use this video introducing week 4 to do 3 things. First, I want to affirm a certain trend that I'm seeing in the discussions, and I just want to make sure you know I'm seeing that, and I want to encourage it. Secondly, I want to talk to you briefly about the interpretive working paper assignment. That's our first formal assignment that will be coming up due in a couple weeks, first draft, and just want to give you some initial kind of indicators on that assignment, help you start thinking about it. And then third, a bit of segue to what we have coming in the segment of the narrative that begins in chapter 8 after Jesus' first discourse, and as I've divided the course, will take us through Jesus' second discourse by the end of this week 4. So first of all, this trend that I'm seeing in the discussion forums that I want to affirm, it's the tendency to frame our interpretation of Matthew in terms of some big questions that we might describe as pastoral questions, ethical questions, political questions, philosophical questions. I just really want to encourage that, because as much as we want to deal carefully with the details of the story and not minimize any of the texture of the narrative or the details of any particular scene, we do want to keep in view that this story is a revelation of God. It is a speaking of God to us that aims to shape our life. And that means that we have to take up both small and big questions in the course of interpreting any part of it, if we're going to do justice to the nature of the story. So I just want you to know that kind of wider scope is totally welcome. And insofar as that's going to get into some contemporary issues that might be controversial, excellent. I think we can do that in a respectful way, and that's part of the purpose of seminary in general, and this class in particular, is to draw our reading of Scripture sort of into the challenges of our life, so that we're turning to it for God to speak to us through the voices of one another, as the Spirit shapes our discussions, our musings, our struggle to understand what Jesus is saying this past week, but what it means to be his disciples in our time. Maybe I'm saying this partly because the subject matter of this past week really emphasizes the high calling that following Jesus is about, and perhaps a sense that many of us have that much of that calling just doesn't seem to have been taken very seriously in many of our church contexts. Instead, we often seem to be more concerned with explaining how we don't have to worry about some things that Jesus says, or that he does as an example to us. So appreciate that tendency, and I just want to encourage it. Secondly, the interpretive working paper you're going to find in the module for week 4. That's still kind of the main view of our course that I encourage you to use. It will help you kind of track the development of the course. And in the materials for this week, you will find the guide for that interpretive working paper assignment. And I just want to say a word about it to get you thinking about it. Obviously, I hope that you will read that guide this week. I also want to encourage you to perhaps choose the passage that you're going to study. There's a list of possible passages to choose in the syllabus, and that's going to be the passage that you study for this interpretive working paper, but then also your advanced interpretive paper a little bit later in the course. For this interpretive working paper, there will be a peer review phase of it, so you will turn a draft of it in on a Google Doc that I will share with you and a partner, and then you'll have some instructions that are going to guide you through a peer review process of your paper before you submit a final draft of it. So that will add a kind of new dimension of how we're working together in this course on the interpretation of Matthew. And just to give you a sort of outline of what I mean by an interpretive working paper. Perhaps the operative term there is especially working. It is a paper that is engaged in the interpretation of a particular passage, but it is interpretation in what I'm calling a working phase. A working phase. That means that it is a little bit more developed, sophisticated than that initial maybe brainstorming phase that you would have as you're interpreting a passage when you're just sort of jotting down notes somewhere. But it's not as developed as when you're ready to land on some kind of settled interpretation of a passage that you're prepared to defend in detail. It's important, I think, to open up this kind of intermediate space where you can probe a passage, where you can ask questions of it and not necessarily have to land yet on how you're going to understand and defend its meaning. That will come later. But in this working phase, that's what you're going to be doing primarily, is you're going to be developing some good searching questions that arise for you as you study the passage that help you kind of frame what the passage might be saying. And then in your paper, you'll be teasing out multiple possible answers to that question that you've asked of the text, and not necessarily landing on one or another at this point. So that's what I mean by a working paper. And I hope that you'll find this not only instructive, but perhaps enjoyable, and to give you a measure of freedom that I think we sometimes lack in our study of Scripture, because we're understandably perhaps committed to the authority of Scripture, its power, and that can make it difficult for us to think in an open-ended way about what it says. So that's my hope this time, is that you'll be able to think in a more open-ended way as you study the passage and really probe its details in this kind of working mode. One of the challenges that I'll be asking you to take up in this paper is a kind of healthy balance between what you might call the place of the passage in the narrative sweep. So you'll be wanting to study the passage, what it has to say in view of where it sits in the flow of the narrative. But at the same time, you're going to want to be focusing carefully on the details of the passage, the kind of intricate development of the scene or the bit of discourse of Jesus's that passage is. Often our study goes too fast, and so this paper invites you to slow your study to like a crawl. Hey, Isaiah, could you turn on the light? This is getting a little dark for my students here. Thanks, man. That's a little better. Hopefully you can see my face. So the last thing that I want to say a word about as you get started on this week's work has to do with the segment of the narrative that is coming up. What I'm going to say is not characteristic of only this segment, but I think this segment allows me to illustrate something that I hope is a sensibility and a set of skills that you're developing in this class that then you'll be bringing to bear on assignments like that interpretive working paper and then developing them there. So the narrative does not present its subject matter in a kind of random sequence. As I think we've already been able to confirm, there's a purpose, a meaning to the order in which the scenes of the narrative come. And so our interpretation of any particular passage has to bear in mind how the meaning of that passage depends upon its place in a sequence. So for example, chapter 8 is going to begin after the transition out of the first discourse of Jesus, where the crowds are astonished at the power of his teaching, by telling us about the power of Jesus, showing us through a sequence of scenes what the power of Jesus is, who Jesus is in virtue of this power. And it begins with an encounter between Jesus and a leper in a nameless place at the foot of the mountain where he has been teaching, and then cuts rather quickly to the encounter between Jesus and a centurion, the commanding officer in the town that he has made his home, Capernaum. And then from there to an intimate interaction between Jesus and the mother-in-law of his disciple, Peter. And this sequence is telling us something about the power of Jesus in virtue of how it develops. So you don't want to interpret them, the three scenes, as if they were independent from one another and could have been told anywhere. You want to actually interpret them as building upon each other and asking interpretive questions about what they have to say as building upon one another. Notice, for example, that because of the sequence, we find that the commanding officer of the occupying army, this Gentile force that is oppressing Jesus' community like so many Gentile empires before it, is forced, as it were, is moved, we might say, to approach Jesus on the same sort of footing, using the same address as the leper has in the previous scene. A leper and a Roman centurion both approaching Jesus as Lord and laying before him a need that they have. Something else to think about with that sequence is that you're going to begin to see that there are colorful characters that populate all of the scenes of the story. And some of our interpretive habits lead us to jump to generalizations about these characters, as if, for example, Jesus' encounter with the centurion in Capernaum is simply that the Capernaum represents Gentiles, and therefore Gentile faith, and Jesus' healing or service to Gentiles and not just Jews. It's not that there's nothing to that at all, but the centurion is not just any Gentile. The centurion, as I've said, is the commanding officer of the Roman power in the land. He is presented to us as a figure of power, a figure of authority. He has a rather elaborate part of speaking in this encounter that's very important for what it is telling us about power, and especially Jesus' power. So we don't want to reduce the characters of the story simply to a general category that they supposedly represent. In each case, and hopefully you'll find that I've tried to do this in what you're going to read of mine, we have to give the thickest description that we can using the terms that the narrative provides of the character with whom Jesus is interacting, and then to use the thickness of that description and all of its nuance to sort of bring out the colors of Jesus in relation to that person or that group of people. In the case of the centurion, he's not pleading for his own life. He's pleading for the life of a servant boy at his home. So those are the kind of details that I hope will bring into our discussion and will enrich your interpretation. I look forward to the week.